Good afternoon and welcome to the 8th Forum in the 2021 edition of the Institute of Policy Studies flagship Singapore Perspectives Conference, the theme of which is Reset. My name is Gillian and I'm deeply privileged to be able to chair this session where we'll discuss the role of values and qualities of leadership in how we reset Singapore to thrive in the year 2030. This is the third of 4 days of a conference, and this third day is organized around our national pledge to build a democratic society. This is in the light of the disruptions that have been brought on by the current COVID-19 global pandemic, as well as other major interrelated shifts in geopolitics, technology, economics, ecology, the social mood and governance that preceded the pandemic, if you cast your mind back to 2018 and 2019. Those of you who have been following this series know that our thought leaders have provided us with a flavor of the different trajectories the future of our country, Singapore, can take. In light of the different trajectories the globe, in all those domains I cited, can take. After all, we stand only a day away from a change in administration in the United States of America, from the presidency of Donald Trump to that of Joe Biden. And with it, hope, as well as deep antipathy in that internally divided superpower around the prospect of sweeping changes in leadership, policies, and state action that it will mean. In Singapore, the fourth generation of leaders from the ruling People's Action Party have more gently moved into position over the past 2 years. And along with that, we've seen leadership renewal in the ranks of the political opposition as well. These leaders are building up their sinews for decision-making in a period of radical uncertainty, as much as citizens are trying to gauge how much these leaders care for them and are attuned to their needs and concerns, and therefore citizens deciding how much to trust them and work with them to craft Singapore's future. Truth be told, there cannot be a time since World War II or the Cold War when values and the technical quality of leadership has been more critical, be it in government, in business, in the scientific community, in national and international civil society. We simply cannot afford a deficit of leadership. A point so clearly made in our session this morning titled Multilateralism and Global Cooperation. So, what are the questions for this session? Well, first, what sorts of leaders, national and international, might the global trends I cited earlier throw up? Or if you think that that question seems so passive and fatalistic an approach, a different question for us to tackle might be, what sorts of leaders in government, business, the scientific and technological community, and society will we need across the globe and certainly in Singapore to interpret the trends, to make the decisions that will benefit long-term human development, the greatest level of happiness for the greatest number of people in the decade and beyond. So if you prefer this second question, then the question to that question is, what sorts of legal, ethical, and governance frameworks are these leaders likely to be confronted by? Will they need to address or even boldly reshape in order to achieve positive human development? And since we're coming to you in Singapore, which is a small city-state, I think it's difficult to talk about achieving happiness, prosperity, and progress without talking about our immediate region and the challenges that the planet is going through. So this local, regional, global nexus is really something that we have to be very conscious of when we speak of leadership. And for those of you who live through it, you know that disruption can be quite precipitous, as was the global financial meltdown in 2008. Or disruption can be gradual and subtle, and then past the tipping point, it can be chronic and extreme, like climate change and resource depletion, where the threat to human habitats in Southeast Asia, of which Singapore is but a small island state, can really leave us with an unthinkable sinking feeling. Or if a people group feels marginalized or misunderstood, they can be radicalized and take the wrecking ball to economic, financial, social, political systems that the rest of us have taken for granted for so long. Our way of life can be blown away before our very eyes. I hope you don't think I'm being hyperbolic, because this is actually what has taken over in the past. And I think we can do no better than to remember what Professor Diamond said this morning, that like with COVID-19, in many of these issues, no country is safe till the world is safe. No country is safe except if we have the leadership that we need, not just in Singapore, but the rest of the world. Okay, we will not dare to be so ambitious in setting out the agenda for this afternoon, except that we have 4 very forceful, experienced, incredible thought leaders before us, and they will rise to the challenge in delivering their points of view over the next few minutes. Let me introduce them in the order that they're addressing you. It's important because they're all leaders in their own right. First, we have Ambassador at Large and Professor Chan Heng Chee, who's the chairperson of the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities in the Singapore University of Technology and Design. But many of you will recognize her as the doyen of the study of political science in Singapore's intellectual circles and globally, but also the doyen of the diplomatic corps when she was Singapore's representative in the United States between 1996 and 2012. Of course, she served with distinction as permanent representative to the United Nations, High Commissioner to Canada and Mexico for Singapore. She's received the inaugural Asia Society Outstanding Diplomatic Achievement Award, the inaugural Foreign Policy Outstanding Diplomatic Achievement Award, and the United States Navy Distinguished Public Service Award for her efforts. She's currently the global co-chair of Asia Society, which is a leading non-profit organization that seeks to build ties between Asia and America. So that's Professor Chan Heng Chee, and good afternoon to you, Professor Chan.
Thank you, Gillian. Gosh, Gillian, I don't know if I can give you remarks that will match the build-up that you gave me, but thank you very much.
Right.
Now, we are asked to think about the values and qualities of leaders we need in the future, in 2030 to be exact. Let me begin by asking you to backcast 10 years ago when it was 2011. It is useful because you can see how much has changed and also how little has changed in 10 years. In 2011, our politics was verging on populist, and the results of the GE was a minor political earthquake in Singapore. I say populist because some of the issues were about jobs, immigration, elitism, the poor and the old, and those left behind. There was a strong desire to see a bigger opposition presence in Parliament. The Workers' Party won their first GRC, Aljunied. The PAP lost 3 ministers in one slate. It was sobering for the party. They did a reset, listened to the ground, and brought in the right policies, social and economic, and in 2015, recaptured lost ground. Now think GE 2020. Some issues were the same. Jobs, fear of the loss of jobs, immigration, to have more diverse voices in Parliament. New issues and concerns were emerging too. The government handling of COVID, efficient government, fairness of government. Things change, but things are the same. 10 years ago, where were we in the world? The United States was just coming out of the global financial crisis. We saw the beginning of a pushback by the United States when they realized China had been more assertive and gaining influence and ground when they were in a funk. Today, US-China relations have never been at such a low point. 10 years ago, we were already talking of black swans, and we were preparing ourselves for the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world took VUCA seriously, watching the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Singapore, we began grappling with and trying to imagine VUCA, technological disruption, and the future of work. How not to be left behind. Then COVID-19 happened. It was different. It was a wake-up call. It was deeply and widely felt. COVID was a VUCA moment that brought home the uncertainty, volatility, and ambiguity. Worldwide, we had an ice bucket shower. What came out clearly in this pandemic is that leadership matters. Think of the countries that did not have good leadership, wafflers and science deniers, and those who politicized science. Leadership was the crucial ingredient. It was not about having the most resources, technology, or medical equipment. It was how leadership communicated the crisis, responded with policy, and mobilized and organized and protected its people. If leadership is so crucial in a VUCA crisis, how do you go about getting good leadership? What sorts of leaders are we looking for? What qualities should they have? Can they be nurtured? And can they be prepared for the testing moment? Should it be a strong man or a collective leadership? In an interview with the McKinsey Global Institute in December 2020, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was asked what good leadership would look like in the next normal. He talked of good leadership as a team working together, building trust, but the leader must be prepared to use talent. But for me, the most interesting thing he said about leadership was, and I quote, "You must be prepared for surprises and setbacks. You can do the right thing. You can make the right decision, but things can easily turn out differently. And you have to be prepared for it psychologically. Well, you've made the best bet. It didn't work. Let's play the cards where they are." Think about what he said, spoken from experience as a leader of the country. Good advice. You will be surprised. There are setbacks. You've done your best, but you must move on and do the best you can to recover. Now, I would add 3 other qualities to leadership in a discussion on this topic. As Gillian says, I'm someone who has watched politics in Singapore for decades, and I speak as a citizen. I will not talk about the obvious qualities, such as charisma, skills in communication, ability to connect with people. It is obvious good leadership, successful leadership, must have the right amount of such qualities. So let me talk of the first point. In the next decade, the world and the region will undergo great changes brought on by great power rivalry and by the COVID pandemic. There will be restructuring. We see countries emerging and countries slipping behind because policies have not kept up and because of incompetent government. In Singapore, the level of competence of government is high, and we should do our best to maintain that. The quality I would like to see in leaders, our leaders, is the ability to be bold and seek to instill a culture of daring to try, to push us so that we will not slip behind. Many of us in Singapore have talked about our shortcomings of complacency and kiasuism. I have a story which illustrates our character brilliantly. A foreign architect told me that he noticed one difference between Singapore and Dubai. When he shows his plans to his Singapore clients of a very innovative and unusual structure, he would be asked, "Has this been built before?" How many times? 3 times? 4 times? Good, we'll do it. In Dubai, if the plans were shown to his Emirati clients, they would ask, "Has this been built before?" If the answer is yes, they are not interested. They want something that is totally new and never been built before. Now, I understand we in Singapore do not want to be reckless, but we can be overcautious. Yes, it is hard to try something new when we have used one playbook over the years and have been successful going along with it. It is hard to let go of what works, even though you know it won't last much longer, and change is necessary. I think business people have the same problem. not just political leaders. When a business strategy or model has worked for a long time, why would you change it until you run into real trouble? Some degree of risk-taking is a necessary quality to be innovative and relevant and to be ready for the political landscape of the future. The second point I want to make, the leadership circle, I think, should reflect the diversity of the population and understand the evolving diversity. This is a quality of qualities crucial for leadership everywhere. But in multiracial Singapore, this is at the heart of politics and society. Globally, identity politics has become more salient. In the US, it has become rancorous and highly divisive. A few days ago, in a session on identities and cohesion, Ambassador Alami Musa discussed diversity in identities and in the increasing complexity of the diversity. He beat me to it by raising the importance of the issue. But from my point of view, it is what leaders should understand fully and grasp. It requires empathy and insight. It is not just about racial diversity, which we are familiar with in Singapore, CMIO. And even with racial diversity, it is getting more complex, and interracial and transnational marriages abound, and hyphenated identities, which Dr. Sharon Siddiqui and I discussed in our book, Singapore's Multiculturalism. It is about gender diversity. First raised when Singapore was self-autonomous in the 1950s. Then we only talked about women's issues. Gender diversity continues to be important, though it has taken new forms. It is not only about equality of opportunity for jobs. Women want to sit on corporate boards or see more women in politics and in political office. Our proportion of women in parliament is 29.5%. After the 2020 elections. Highest percentage so far. By the way, Britain's is 34% in parliament, by way of comparison. Actually, women in Singapore are doing increasingly better in politics and in political office. In recent years, LGBTQ has emerged as a significant gender diversity issue, because it is about the legitimacy of status and rights of those who identify themselves as LGBTQ. It is not an easy issue for Singapore, as we are a conservative society with segments of the population who have difficulty accepting this. The question is whether leadership in the next decade should lead society on this issue and point to a progressive outcome, or be led by society, waiting for society to change. On diversity, I believe leaders now have to pay greater attention to what the younger demographics in our society are saying and reaching for. They should listen and raise the concerns or point out the misconceptions. Many have been in universities in Singapore and overseas. Our politicians have been good in promoting the Great Singapore Conversation and more recently initiating the Singapore Together movement with the people to discuss and design policies for community-level partnerships. Our leaders learned that climate change is an issue that resonates with the young. It is also an issue that people at the top here, our leaders, consider an essential one, an existential one for Singapore. Now, if you go into Instagram today, young people are discussing serious social issues like anti-racism, racial justice, and social justice. Instagram used to be about lifestyle. You will see 10 picture frames of food, social gatherings, and fashion. These days, there are serious discussions about gender inequality, racial inequality, and inequality regarding migrant workers. Now, this may explain the explosion of heated views and reaction to Chinese privilege which was discussed in the identities session and trending on social media. Allow me to digress and say something about Chinese privilege. Minorities feel there is Chinese privilege because they encounter racism and prejudice in Singapore and institutional racism. I understand why they say that. We need to keep working hard to eradicate racism. But I want to provide the perspective that actually a segment of the Chinese population in Singapore disagree that there is such a thing as Chinese privilege. They remember that at the birth of our nation, the Chinese community was told by Lee Kuan Yew that they should set aside their claims for majoritarianism and accept that Chinese would not be the national language, even though they were the overwhelming majority population. Then in the 1980s, Nanyang University was merged with the University of Singapore. That was how NUS came to be. This episode was painful for the Chinese educated community. They were asked to attend classes in NUS in English, a language they were not equipped to handle at the tertiary level. Many dropped out. They were angry and unhappy with the government. So perhaps Chinese privilege is not as appropriate to use in Singapore given their history. Our social scientists, as Daniel Goh points out, have come up with other terms to describe our situation of racial inequality. Now let me turn to point number 3. Oh, don't troll me, please. Point number 3. I believe future leadership must be intergenerational, a combination of generations in the leadership circle. We are in the era of the young leader. Although, if you look at the United States, the US has made this an era of older leaders. Justin Trudeau became PM at the age of 43. He's 49 today. France elected Emmanuel Macron at 39. He's 43 today. And Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, took office at 37. She's 40 today. When Prime Minister Lee said he was determined to plan succession and step down at 70, I thought he should not. But PM was aware of the trends out there then. And our younger population is articulate with strong opinions, especially those who have received tertiary education. Increasingly, they form a good 2/3 of the working population. They are our PMETs. They are digitally empowered and have expectations. But leadership should be intergenerational because in Singapore, we face an aging electorate and an aging workforce. It is essential to have all segments reflected to ensure a good understanding of the aging issues. In our recent election, we saw candidates who were in their 50s and 60s, and an 80-year-old fielded by the opposition parties. The PAP's youngest of the new candidates was 30 years old, and the oldest was 50. It was remarked upon, so remarkable was his showing up on the ticket. That is because the PAP emphasized fielding younger candidates in past elections. Now, going forward, I think the ruling party is likely to go intergenerational too in their choice of candidates. Now, Gillian asked, and this is by way of conclusion, how we can help leaders make better decisions. There is the good old scenario planning exercise that government bureaucracies play with. And this morning, we heard about the Finns and how they were very good at gaming and playing scenarios and getting prepared, and leadership must be prepared. This helps leaders to anticipate problems. They can game situations and work out how they will react. But I think that only does so much. In the end, it is the character and personality of the people in charge which will decide how they act. Then there is a sandbox approach of experimenting with a solution to see how it works before implementing on a larger scale. I have referred to our non-NMPs and NCMPs as sandboxes for the PAP government to try out how to handle the opposition, especially in debate. China used SEZs to try out liberalizing the economy and experimenting with capitalism. They opened up Shenzhen, Shuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. But I think in the end, what is important is that leaders must want to lead. They must possess the passion and conviction to lead and a vision they want to implement. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Chan, for your strong opening. I think we have good footing for the ongoing conversation on values and qualities of leadership. You said that you feel leaders have to be prepared to recognize the cards that they're given and to play them. And if things go wrong, prepared to recover. And you talked about, therefore, the value of scenario planning, but really that there should be an ongoing process using sandboxes to think innovatively and be prepared for the unthinkable. And you said that it is somewhat down to character and personality of the leaders. But on top of that, I think there are three key points that you made, that leaders must have the ability to instill in the people they lead as well, the culture of daring to do. So they must do it themselves. And as they do that, lead the others, give license to the others to do that. Secondly, you felt that especially in Singapore, leaders have to reflect the diversity that you find in multicultural Singapore. And then the third point, which is also itself about diversity, that leadership in Singapore has to be intergenerational. So thank you for that great opening. And we'd like to now give the floor to Professor Margaret Heffernan. Let me say a few words about her. She's a dear friend of Singapore, has visited many times, but is herself is a global thought leader in the area of management and leadership. Professor Heffernan is Professor of Practice at the University of Bath and is lead faculty for the Forward Institute's Responsible Leadership Program. She is the author of very many well-received books, and let me just name two because they're especially relevant for our conversation today. First, her most recent book called Uncharted, How to Map the Future, which was published in 2020, last year. It's a treatise on the merits of strategic thinking for leaders. The second book, Willful Blindness, published in 2012. Willful Blindness, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril. This book was named by the Financial Times as one of the most important business books of the decade. It was an appeal for leaders to have the force of courage to do what is right in their strategic organizational decisions to avoid disasters, collapse, and even sometimes crimes against humanity, because such is their sphere of influence. Professor Heffernan is a mentor to many CEOs and senior executives of major organizations around the world through Merrick and Company. She holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Bath, and she is speaking to us from Bath this morning for her. So good morning again, Professor Heffernan, and it's over to you. You have 15 minutes on this very important topic of values and qualities of leaders.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and welcome to everybody watching at the moment. In 2016, after years of debate and stalemates, the Irish government decided to hold a citizens' assembly to decide what to be done about the law regarding abortion. The topic was a hot potato in Ireland. No political party wanted to touch it, and Prime Minister Enda Kenny was widely mocked for kicking the can down the road. What's the point of a leader who can't make his own decisions? What good could a bunch of barmen, parents, electricians, nurses, and truck drivers do that an elected parliament couldn't? 99 participants were recruited who roughly represented the nation's population. They signed up to work for 12 weekends over a period of 18 months to listen to a series of presentations by lawyers, academics, doctors, and ordinary people to advise the government whether or not to hold a referendum. Few had any idea just how much work would be involved. They were welcomed by the Prime Minister, who said this: We choose to go about our business this way so that as a nation and as a society, we can move from a position of contention, even of contempt, and find invaluable consensus, some common coordinates in a matter so privately and publicly tender. Key words: contention, contempt, consensus, common coordinates. The government went to enormous lengths to make the exercise as transparent as possible. Every single presentation was streamed online. Every briefing paper was stripped of jargon and published in English, Irish, and Braille. No lobbying organizations or pressure groups could present, but those with lived experience or non-aligned expertise did. A mass exercise in public education, 13,000 submissions were made by the public. On the 23rd of April in 2017, the Assembly voted 64% in favor of a referendum proposing the liberalization of abortion up to 12 weeks. The perceived wisdom in political classes was that this was so far from public opinion as to be useless. And media headlines agreed, asking how so extreme a view could be watered down to make it palatable to the population. On the 25th of May, 2018, in an almost perfect mirror image of the Assembly, the electorate of Ireland voted 66% in favor of liberalization. Of course, those who had argued for liberalization for years were thrilled, but I don't think that's the really important part of this story. What mattered most, what was remarkable, was that even those who did not like the outcome of this decision accepted its legitimacy. And where citizens who had previously shown contempt for their government, now they felt pride in the way that it had healed such a long seeping wound. This had not been an abnegation of leadership after all, but the essence of it. So what are the lessons to be learned here? The process embodied the belief that everybody matters, that it wasn't the loudest or the richest or the oldest or the most powerful that decided. The desire for consensus was not abandoned as just too hard or bound to be too weak. It was embraced as an achievable goal. In other words, it expressed trust in citizens, their capacity to work, to think, to understand, and to listen. And that trust was repaid. The process also reflected a belief that leadership is and must be a constantly evolving experiment, that respect for tradition and institutions need not block the capacity to change. I'd even go further and say that it acknowledged that as the world was changing, so the government now had to do something different, both to reflect that change and to understand it better. But this was not a thoughtless rush to play with a new toy. It was a highly meticulous, rigorous exercise designed to ensure that the widest range of voices were heard, so that instead of recycling and amplifying bias and prejudice, people had what they needed to think for themselves. The quality of leadership that Enda Kenny showed was not about solving the problem, but knowing the process that would, and not being afraid of the experiment. He did not try to impose certainty where there was none. We talk a lot about leadership these days. When things don't work, it's a failure of leadership. And when they do work, it shows that leadership really counts. I often think that it's rather like education. It is both the cause and the solution of all our woes. But as we try to imagine the future, this capacity to respect citizens, to treat them as capable adults, seems to me a fundamental quality. When I talked to the barmen and plumbers and parents and technicians who took part in the assembly, it was clear to me how seriously they had taken their task and how much they, and indeed the entire population of Ireland, had learned from the trustworthy information they'd been given. As every parent learns, treating children like children tends to keep them that way, Treating them as adults is how they grow. Moreover, the experience communicated two things that are crucial to leadership. It imbued each participant with a sense of personal responsibility for those other than themselves. As one of them said to me, I suddenly realized it wasn't me that would be affected by that law. I've had my kids already, but I had to think about other people and other lives. And it made people think about the impact of their decision on the future, beyond the immediate, to the consequences for their children and their children's children and their society. Everyone who took part felt that responsibility. They were a little intimidated by it, but they knew they could not set it aside. And those, I think, are essential qualities for leadership today. The capacity for humility. It isn't just about me or those like me, and it isn't just about now. I take responsibility for the long-term consequences of my decision. This isn't new, but we've definitely seen around the world that in many cases it has been forgotten. What was new was a serious creative collaboration between citizens and their government. This went far beyond data collection, surveys, polling, focus groups. It acknowledged that in face-to-face discussion and lived experiences of others, that we could change our perspectives. And this might sound really obvious, and perhaps it should be obvious, but over the past decade, I think we've seen a dangerous belief that has gained traction to the effect that we can't really learn from each other. We're all so biased and we're so self-centered. We're so polarized and wedded to our own beliefs. There's no point trying to talk to each other. We're just condemned to isolation in our own bubbles of belief. But this isn't true. Another beautiful experiment that started in Germany and has spread around the world has shown this. Jochen Wegener of Die Zeit online created a little app that he called Tinder for Politics. It wasn't quite like Tinder because it asked people a series of questions about politics, and then it matched them with their opposite and asked them if they'd like to meet. They were amazed that thousands did want to meet, and even more amazed by the outcome. 94% enjoyed the experience. Of the 6% who didn't, it was mostly because their counterpart had failed to turn up. People had learned from each other. Many had changed their mind. Some even got married. Leadership requires the capacity to believe that people can talk, argue, debate, and learn. It requires trust in that process, and it resists outsourcing the difficult emotions involved to mere data gathering. It recognizes that collective intelligence, the ability to make good decisions together, depends on developing social capital, knowing each other, developing trust, learning how to listen and even look for all the information and life experiences one does not have oneself. This is as true in business as it is in politics. It's the reason why many companies as different as HSBC, Philips, Pixar, and Microsoft have developed various different forms of open strategy. Processes where huge parts, sometimes even all of the company, are involved in exploring strategic options. It's done with structure, with a lot of attention to detail. It is not just chat, but it's driven by two considerations. First, that often the best ideas come from people working outside their domain expertise, because they can reframe the problem and identify different approaches. It doesn't deny the importance of expertise, but seeks to add to it. And second, that those who participate in making the future have much more motive and knowledge with which to support it. That shouldn't be taken for granted by leaders, though it often is. You only need to look at unionizing in Google to see how easily legitimacy can slip from the fingers of leaders too convinced that they know best. In whose name are these decisions being made? Is the question Google's well-off workforce is asking about their company's strategy. Identity, in their minds, has become part of the social contract. Deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies and indeed unions speak to this growing demand for legitimacy as derived from participation, not just institutional power. In my opinion, this matters even more post-pandemic, when we've seen how many companies and organizations were dependent on the commitment and energy of some of their lowliest and least paid employees. Deliberative processes acknowledge that interdependence. Now, of course, this broadening of participation is not a substitute for decision-making, the essential work of leaders. In Ireland, the citizens' assemblies advise Parliament. They don't make the decisions. In open strategy, groups make recommendations to the board or to the executive committees. In some organizations, I'm starting to see the emergence of shadow boards. These are made up of younger generations, demographically representative, who can make recommendations to the governing bodies of their companies. And it speaks to the need for intergenerational participation that Professor John referenced. What all of these manifestations of leadership do is acknowledge that in a complex world, a VUCA world, it is impossible to know enough or to see enough. That working towards a better future requires huge amounts of imagination and creativity, not to be willfully blind to emerging issues, and to find the right processes for addressing problems. That working collaboratively with as diverse a range of people, experience, know-how produces more and better options than even the best and the brightest. And that working together both drives knowledge and insight across the entire organization, or, as in Ireland, across the entire country. That in turn leads to what I think of as the definition of a good decision, decisions that can be explained and understood, without which they don't work. And all of these things together bring to decisions a legitimacy without which a society can begin to fracture. I want to close with three last quick thoughts. First, in the work I do with business leaders, I'm very struck by how busy they are. Long days, an impossible to-do list, a sense of always being on the run. That kind of goes with the territory. But what concerns me is that in their desire to run as fast as time, many of them have lost the ability to think, to spend time alone, having, as Hannah Arendt would say, a conversation with themselves. This is, of course, what they are paid to do, and the one thing they struggle with most. Listening to the peripheral thoughts at the edge of their minds. This is what artists do all the time. It's why they're frequently ahead. And it's why the experience of creative work is, I think, essential to leadership development. Second, in Robert Putnam's most recent book, The Upswing, which looks at how America changed course between 1880 and the present, he finds that leadership is a lagging indicator. That change started at the grassroots way before leadership responded to it. It's a really provocative thought that leaders are often behind until they start to listen hard. And very often, as we've seen, it takes activists to bring them up to date. That's another lesson to be taken from the Citizens' Assembly. Finally, one of the many things I love about scenario planning is that in the construction of multiple scenarios lies an acceptance of uncertainty, knowing we do not know the future. That's why creativity is so important, to imagine what isn't there, and why the power of convening is essential, to gather, inform, co-create, and learn together what is going to be experienced together. The heart and soul of the social contract is the heart and soul of leadership. The faith that we can do more together and better than anything we can make alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Heffernan, for that tour de force on leadership. I think what's quite special about what you presented is that you believe leaders are those who have faith and trust in empowering citizens to be adults, to have the experience, the expertise, the ground feel, and even the sensing of emerging trends to inform leadership and better decision making. But the second point is that then means that leaders also have to invest in a process that allows for citizens to come together, either among themselves, to convene, share and collaborate, or to do so and advise, as was the case with Citizen Assembly on Abortion, Parliament, and let the leaders then respond to that. And the third point that you have made is actually at the personal and individual level, that leaders, you said, have been too busy to actually take the time to think, which is what they're paid for. And that you recognize that actually they need time to listen to some of the peripheral thoughts on the edge of their minds in order to generate what is creative, what is different, or to really create something that is like the artists do, something that's emergent and respond possibly to complex issues, but also take the world on a different tilt if they just took the time. So thank you for that, Professor Heffernan. And now leaves me to introduce our two very distinguished discussants. They will be responding to what they've heard from Professor Chan and Professor Heffernan, and they are deeply rooted within the community, within Singapore community. The first is, of course, Mr. Han Fook Kwang, who is one of the most distinguished journalists in Singapore, editor-at-large of Singapore's main English broadsheet, The Straits Times, and senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University. Mr. Han has co-authored several books on Singapore's founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, including Lee Kuan Yew, the Man and His Ideas, Hard Truths to Keep Singapore Going, and One Man's View of the World. He has actually written several articles now on the nature of Singapore's fourth generation leaders. So still deeply interested in the quality of leadership in Singapore and continuing to contribute his thoughts on the matter. Mr. Han, may we invite you to give us your thoughts on what Professor Chan and Professor Heffernan has said, and also what you yourself would like to contribute and add to this discussion. Mr. Han, it's over to you, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gillian. Wonderful to be here. I think both speakers, Professor Chan Heng Chee and Professor Heffernan, have framed the leadership issues very well, and I don't disagree with any of the points they made. I like Heng Chee's 3 points about the leadership issues that are relevant to Singapore, particularly her point about developing this culture of daring to try, which I think is especially relevant to Singapore. I think any leader that is able to do that deserves a gold medal, and I'm not sure we are there yet. I also like Professor Hefferman's very, very insightful comments about the relationship between leaders and the people, and how important it is to build this to build trust between leaders and the people, and that it is the social contract between leaders and the people which is at the heart of leadership. And I think I shall be talking a bit about that as well. This question about leadership, I think, has a special place in Singapore, not because Singapore is a special country or our leaders are special, but because of the constant refrain since independence, since day one of independence, that Singapore is highly dependent on good, strong leadership. And that without good, strong leadership, we will not even survive. I know it's like air or water. And this has resulted in a certain expectation of the people about their leaders, about the qualities and values of the leadership, an expectation that was formed very early on during the early years of independence. Many of our founding leaders are obviously very competent, and their policies have obviously been very effective in helping Singapore go from third world to the global city it is today. But I believe that it was their values that were decisive. And the leadership was values driven. They believe very strongly in certain principles, including meritocracy, rule of law, zero tolerance for corruption, and equality among the races. Values at that time informed policy. It was values first, then policy. And if you look at some of the successful policies that were implemented, I think you can see what I mean. Take public housing, for example. So it's not just about physically building housing estates and trying to house, almost the entire population, but the very strong belief that if everyone owns his home, it will increase his stake in the country, and more importantly, his stake in the future of the country. But homeowners are also expected to pay for their flat. And this was founded in the very important principle that nobody owes you a living and you have to be responsible for your own upkeep. And I think the reason why leaders at that time were so effective and were seen to be good leaders worthy of the people's respect was because I think people understand values more than they understand policy. So people understand what meritocracy is all about, that nobody owes you a living. And as a result of that very deep understanding, there was a connection with the leaders because people knew what they stood for. And that connection, I believe, can be made only through moral leadership that is values driven, not through policy. I also believe it is the same today, even though it is a completely different world. In fact, I would argue that it is even more important because it is a noisier world. And this is the second point I want to make. We all know it is noisier because of the internet and social media. There's so many competing voices. So what differentiates someone from another and the rest of the 1,000 other voices there are? How does the leader stand out in the crowd and win the respect? I think he stands out if people see him as a real person with feelings and emotions, with strong conviction about what he believes in, who keeps his words, and is seen as one with the people, not somebody who is aloof and detached. And I think these are exactly the same qualities which mattered before. The problem with the digital world is that with all the tools available to the leader, through social media, videos, all the glitzy stuff that might help him spread the message, but they can detract from the most important thing, which is to make the leader human in the eyes of the people, someone real who can make an emotional connection with them. It is not about the message, but the person. Who is this person who is their leader? So I believe leadership is less about competence than it is about character and morality. Of course, competence is important and results must bear this out, but competence can also be delivered by paid professionals, by civil servants, and a professionally run civil service. But moral leadership is something else. It's about inspiring leadership, about shaping attitudes and behavior, about forging a sense of community and of a shared future. Is it more difficult to achieve this today than in the past? I think only if our leaders allow it to be so. And this is my third point about the noisier world we live in and the role leaders have in this world. Because it is so noisy, I think there is a greater danger of leaders getting distracted by the noise and worse, pursuing the noisemakers unproductively. You know, you can have all the laws in the world to try to shut out that noise, and Singapore has introduced several, including a law we have which we call POFMA. But you must be clear what is it you want to achieve that will be long-lasting and worth the effort. If I could cite just one example from the past, you know, Singapore in its early days of independence also faced much misinformation from across the causeway, arising out of the quarrelsome circumstances of its separation with Malaysia. Malay language newspapers up north frequently carried anti-Singapore news and commentaries. How did our founding leaders, especially Lee Kuan Yew, deal with them? I think his approach was counterintuitive. He did not censor them or shut them out from the Singaporean audience. Instead, he encouraged Singapore newspapers to publish these anti-Singapore commentaries from Utusan Melayu, which is the main Malay newspaper in Malaysia, because he wanted Singaporeans to know what they were doing to harm Singapore. On our own, you know, the Straits Times, which is the main English language newspaper here, would have ignored these commentaries because they were so one-sided and unworthy of publications. But Mr. Lee saw it completely differently. He saw it as an opportunity to educate Singaporeans on what was happening across the causeway and what these ultra-Malays were doing. That to him was more important than the risk that some Singaporeans may unwittingly believe in the Malaysian propaganda. I think this requires great clarity of thinking about what the crux of the issue was. So it wasn't about rebutting those issues, those views and shutting them out. That's all peripheral to the main issue. And if you pursue them, then you might be blown off course. So I'm raising this not to revisit the past, but because I believe that in the new world, this globalized and very digitally connected world, there are many distractions that leaders are faced with, you know, fueled by social media, even mainstream media. And if you follow what is generating the most interest or trending, you can get, and often do get, blown off course. And in such an environment, leaders have to be very clear-headed and even single-minded about what the most important issues are. So I think I'll stop here and I can elaborate on some of the points, hopefully, during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Han, for that intervention, and you know, appreciate how you are referencing our own political history again, and cited how Singaporeans were won over by values much more than policy. They understand values more than they do policy, and they should be addressed through values than the detail or the minutiae of policies. People want to know why the policies are being introduced or implemented. Second, that you said that in a noisier world, what will matter again are those values and sense of morality than just a mere competence, because competence can be delivered by civil servants. There's a technical part of it rather than just the why, the values behind the policies. And finally, in a noisier world in terms of media and information, leaders have to be clear-headed and single-minded in discerning what is the most important message that should go through. And in fact, sometimes these can be quite counterintuitive for a larger national or strategic purpose. So thank you for that. And finally, last but not least, please allow me to introduce a very important community leader in Singapore, and that is none other than Ms. Zuraida Abdullah. Ms. Zuraida Abdullah has a distinguished record of public service. She is Singapore's first woman to become Senior Assistant Commissioner of the Singapore Police Force. After a retirement from SPF, she has now been appointed the CEO of Mendaki, which is a self-help group for the Malay Muslims in Singapore. She is the recipient of very many national awards for her leadership. And I think without further ado, please allow me to pass the time over to you, Ms. Zuraida. You have 5 minutes to share with us your take on what you have heard.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you too to Ambassador Chan, Professor Heffernan, and Mr. Hunt for your sharing. I would like to start first by building on Ambassador Chan's point about being bold and instilling a culture of daring to try in our leaders. Now, I agree with her fully, and given that we are operating in a VUCA environments now, we need leaders who can be bold and who dare to try. Now, in fact, this is consistent with the report by the Conference Board Global Leadership Forecast in 2014 and 2015, in which it says that VUCA-ready leaders are those who can first anticipate and react to the nature and the speed of change, who can act decisively without always having clear SOPs or directions and no certainties, one who can navigate through complexity, chaos, and confusions, and also one who can maintain effectiveness despite constant surprises and lack of predictability. Now, apart from all these qualities, I am also of the view that first and foremost, VUCA-ready leaders must also be comfortable operating in such an environment. You can't have people who cannot deal with chaos and who cannot work with chaos. Now, while he or the leaders for the future is a risk taker, the last thing we want to do is to have someone who's a kamikaze leaders. So firstly, I would like to look at it. Ambassador Chan was asking, so where can we get such leaders? And well, I suggest that we look first at our youth, and because they are going to be the future leaders. And we currently as a leaders asking how can we help them develop these qualities and so that they can be ready in the next decades and beyond. What kind of environments must we create and expose them to so that they are not risk averse and dare to try? Now, if I can borrow the metaphor used by Senior Minister Tarmand during the interview in May 2015 at the St. Gallen Symposium in Switzerland, can we provide a trampoline, not a safety net for them to bounce and climb higher when they fail or fall? But that doesn't mean getting them to keep bouncing endlessly. Now, secondly, a society too must play an important role to providing an appropriate environment for such leaders to thrive. And as such, I thought that we should not just focus about what kind of leaders we need, but what kind of society we need that will enable such leaders to thrive. Now, in this case itself, I think that we need to relook at how we see failed experiences and think of them as learning points. Now, Han mentioned about the history about how our leaders then, and there are learning points as well from that. Professor Heffernan as well mentioned, how can we learn? How can we shape that society that we want? It's not just about leaders respecting the citizens, but also society respecting views of divergent views on the ground. And how can we identify individuals who fail as risk takers